Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few dollars in your wallet and try and give you some financial education. And today we continue in our series on the U.S. financial system and the history of the U.S. financial system. And we're going to start with, where else would we start? With the U.S. Constitution. Because this little document is what the Founding Fathers gave us to figure out how the hell our country should be run. And they didn't just give us this. They also gave us this guy, the Federalist Papers, which is basically the pontifications of the smart people who are deciding how to set up a country based off of their history of how all countries have been run since, well, the dawn of civilization as we know it. Modern civilization. We'll call it 5,000 years ago. So, the U.S. Constitution gave us the ability of the government, right? And in here, Section 8, right, is the Constitution talking about what powers it shall have. And it says, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debits and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Now, what does uniform mean? Uniform means, and originally this is 13 colonies, so we're talking about 13 states. That means that each state is going to pay the same amount of taxes. Okay? And that if the Congress creates duties, imposts, and excise taxes, that those are going to be equal in every state as well. The idea meaning that the shipyard that accepts ships into Georgia isn't taxed at a higher rate for the same amount for sugar than would be in New York City, right? So that all states would have the exact same taxation structure, and all states would give equally to the federal government. Now, why is that important specifically? The importance of this is that this means that the federal government can't just grow to whatever size it wants to. It can't just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the taxes paid by each state must be the same. And remember, one of those founding states is Rhode Island, which is not a very big state. So Rhode Island can't be providing the same amount of taxes that New York State will be providing, especially if the taxes keep going up. So if the taxes are kept at a low level that each state must provide, then those can be done. And this was done intentionally, very, very, very intentionally. And we're going to talk about that intentionality and why they described it the way they did and why they set it up the way they did. Because remember, the Founding Fathers of the United States were some pretty smart people. And they had the luxury of history and understanding that history from the Greeks and the Romans and Mesopotamia all through Europe, through all of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and all of the periods. And they had all of the examples of government, a lot of which came from feudalism with kings and queens and these people deciding. Or they knew about the Mongols and Genghis Khan, and one guy is in charge. They had dealt and understood about Napoleon, and one guy being in charge of that country as well. And they basically understood all of these pitfalls that, actually, I'm not sure Napoleon's in there. That might have been after. I'll have to check that one. Yeah, sometimes you do enough research into these things, everything starts getting a little confusing. But anyway, they had the examples of history laid out in front of them, of all of these examples of governments and how they failed and how the citizenry reacted, and when there were revolts or why different countries went to war over different things. And a lot of the Federalist Papers, especially the first 10, discuss in detail the reasons to have a union. And a lot of the reasons of the union are so that the states wouldn't fight amongst themselves, because that's what happened in Europe all the time, is all of these countries were fighting amongst themselves constantly having wars. I mean, go to the British War Museum, and it's unbelievable how many times they were fighting with France. It's crazy. Like how many wars there were. It's like every time some king came to power and decided, let's go fight the French. And then the next guy would come along, I'm done fighting the French right now. Let's marry a few French women. Let's go fight the French again. Let's marry a few of them. Let's fight. Back and forth. And they didn't want that to happen. So part of the whole reason for the states becoming one territory was to limit the fighting that might happen amongst themselves, to limit the fighting that might happen if a few of them ganged up on another one and just wanted to impose their will, and also to protect all from foreign invaders, right? Which you see that in the Constitution as well. But as far as the Constitution goes financially, the next section says that states are not allowed to coin money or create their own currency. So Section 10 comes in and says, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of Marquian reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill attainder ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. So the no title of nobility is obviously an ode to the feudal system. And it also goes then and continues to say, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by the state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of Congress. No state, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war, unless actually invaded, or any such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So this limited the state's power to impose duties on imports and exports, and gave that specific responsibility and right to the money from that to the federal government. So this also prevented states from having their own different duties on it, and therefore fighting amongst themselves between which port does this ship come into, one that has a high duty or a low duty. If the states are imposing extra duties, then you have all this, again, fighting amongst states, or what is often typically, the race to the bottom in taxation and you see this right now with taxation going on. And the founding fathers knew this exact kind of thing would happen. So you have if you go to Europe right now, you have Ireland, which is imposing the lowest tax rate on corporations. So lots of companies have offices in Ireland, right? If you go to the Cayman Islands, that could be zero. So there are no places with no taxes whatsoever, right? And we'll get into it in the Federalist Papers, but these smart people knew this, talked about it openly. That's what happened. All right, so what is money? Real money. According to the Constitution, gold and silver are real money, such that, Congress said it, right? It was right in that first section. And only gold and silver was money. That's real money. States are not allowed to make anything except gold and silver legal tender for paying debts. Okay? So that meant that only gold and silver could be accepted as legal payment for debts. So that means if you're writing contracts, right? I agree to pay you, or you agree to pay me for certain things. Those contracts would have to be written in gold and silver as the only marks of legal tender. And that the states had nothing to do with that and could not change that. And what they wanted to prevent was states preventing, or it's not what was states preventing. What they wanted to prevent was states creating their own currencies, each having their own currency and each being different, and each being in different denominations. And in fact, with that, all paper money was redeemable in gold. And that's what the U.S. currency used to say on it, redeemable in gold by the United States Treasury. And if we look at what was given to the federal government as its responsibilities and its rights, because let's go back, the states were not given the right to coin money, right? So only the federal government was given the right to coin money, which is why you don't see, even to this day, you don't see any states that have their own gold and silver minting. It's all minted by the Federal Reserve. It's all minted by the federal government because the Constitution says that the federal government has the right to coin money, money being gold and silver. Now, why do they want to do this? Specifically to prevent different denominations from proliferating in each state. So if you went to Europe before the euro, you kind of had this problem as you crossed country to country. So you could get on a train and you could go through 4 or 5 countries in a day. Well, let's suppose you get off the train from France and Belgium, and you're then catching a train to Germany. Well, while you're in Belgium, you need Belgian dollars, not French francs. And I don't even know what Belgian dollars used to be, so I'm calling them Belgian dollars, right? So you need Belgian money, so you would have to convert your French francs to Belgian money to buy things in the train station in Belgium. And then when you got to Germany, you would need to convert that money into German Deutschmarks so that you could use that money in Germany. And basically what they wanted to do was prevent that from happening in each state in the United States, where also the size of coins could be very different. So while we have, everybody knows what the coins are in the United States. We have the penny, the nickel, the dime, and the quarter. Well, if each state was allowed to do their own, Rhode Island might decide we like 75-cent pieces, 38-cent pieces, 17-cent pieces, and 12-cent pieces. And then New York might decide, no, we want 75-cent pieces, 40-cent pieces, and a 15-cent piece. And then Connecticut might decide, no, we want a 5-cent piece and a 55-cent piece. And everybody's confused going back and forth between trying to figure it out. So to try and make money, transparent in terms of weights and measures. So that's what everything used to be called, weights and measures. And it was literally based off of weight. It's why we still understand an ounce to be an ounce today, an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver, right? And then it was minted into a coin that was 1 ounce. And then it was minted into smaller coins that were fractions of those ounces, such that transactions could be done in whatever denomination was necessary to break up those silver and gold coins, right? And prior U.S. money coins actually used to be made of, ding, 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 silver. We actually put the real silver in. There was a certain percentage of it, and then they started diluting it. Now there's none in there. Now it's a copper coin worth basically nothing. Now, any paper money could not be made up by the states. So the states couldn't have their own paper money redeemable in some other thing. This was preventing the states from creating their own treasury departments. This was very intentional. So we would have one treasury department. There would be one standard for the entire country. That's what the founding fathers were after. They were not after the government having control over the printing press of money, because the government was only supposed to be able to coin it, not create paper bills. Any paper bills created by the federal government were redeemable in gold. And redeemable meant that you were allowed to transfer them in. So now we have what's known as fiat currency. That's just literal pieces of paper. It's not backed by anything, right? And the only reason that people consider it valuable is that those governments also have the ability to tax its citizens, therefore collect more paper money back from the citizens that it can then give you if it owes you the debt. So taxation becomes the key principle when you don't want to deal with gold and silver anymore. So gold is money. So check this out. This is an old $5 bill, and it says redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, so the Federal Reserve Bank, you could walk in with your money and get gold. This was the way the U.S. financial system worked from 1776, when the Constitution was signed, all the way up until 1913, when they started messing with it. Redeemable in gold. Now, that does not mean that everybody redeemed their money in gold all the time and transacted in gold. They didn't have to, because they actually believed that this currency was worth something, because I would accept the currency from you knowing that that currency was redeemable in gold if I wanted to get my gold, right? Well, what happens when everyone wants to get their gold? And that's the story of finance in America. So let's discuss why the Constitution was set up this way and what the Founding Fathers were thinking. And for that, we're going to go to the Federalist Papers. So we start with Federalist Paper number 10. And the Federalist Paper number 10, they're going to tell us about warning about what might happen. And in Federalist Paper number 10, it says, and this is a quote that I just find fantastic given the current state of politics. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And the idea here was that, they say right before that, it is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. And the clashing interests that he starts with are the propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interest in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, and many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilizations, and these divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal tasks of modern legislation. So he basically lays out right there the idea of what government's here to do. Government is here to try and figure out what is fair and equal in a place where a creditor and a debtor have differences of opinions, which how could that possibly ever happen with humans, right? And what he says is if you leave this up to the government in terms of if you leave it up to just the will of the democracy, writ at large, that we're going to, let's vote every week on whether or not we like this law or not. That's not going to end up in any fairness. That's going to end up with mob mentality, and then you just need to be part of the mob at the right time. So what he's saying is that ideally, statesmen would help figure these things out, but you can't rely on all statesmen being enlightened going forward. So that I find it's completely true. Just what a matter of fact to say that, and this is a hard thing to do. So then they say, hey, what are we going to do about it? And they say that, the causes of factions cannot be removed, and that the relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects, i.e., we know these things are going to exist. What can we do to help prevent them from being a problem, right? So they get into the part that I have up here, which is a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular country or district than an entire state. This, again, is one of the arguments over having a republic versus the democracy, because the republic principle says that the Senate, for example, has 2 senators from every state, such that just because it is the will of California and New York, they only have 4 senators. So they can't just push stuff through like they can in the House because they have more representatives. And this is the idea of the republic, is that the mob doesn't get to control. So if the mob is California and New York, because they have the most people who think a certain way, they don't get to decide what's best for Nebraska and South Dakota. And this is the whole idea of a republic. And that everything is not decidable and changeable very quickly. This is the whole idea, because what he says in here, I mean, doesn't it make sense that a rage for paper money, if the government can just print money? This is what's going on right now with these stimulus checks. The government's literally printing money, and it's being allowed to happen. Now, the Senate could prevent this from happening, but they've decided they don't want to. An equal division of property. We keep hearing about that all the time. We want equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is good. Equality of outcome is horrible. And not only that, but they list these first things as improper and wicked. And yet those are what's going on right now, right? An abolition of debts. Now, while I don't disagree that the 2 sides of the student loan debate are not fair because the government set up the system and created its own inequalities within the system, the abolition of debts idea that, hey, we're just not going to pay, we shouldn't have to, that's wrong as well. So this is the republic versus democracy debate over why the Constitution was set up, but it gets into very much how we're talking about money and economics. And you can't separate the two. You can't go, well, we want government over here to regulate these things, we want economic stuff here, and we want rights of citizens over here. They're intertwined. And the Founding Fathers knew that, and they tried to go through it as best could be in terms of describing it. And what I love about the Federalist Papers is that they're giving you that whole perspective. They're giving you the nuance of it. They're describing you why we came up with the things that are in the Constitution. We didn't just pull them out of a hat and go, we like this stuff. These were long and hard thought about things. They went over them constantly and beat them up to no end. So they knew the difference between a pure democracy and a republic. So they said specifically, to prevent the mob from deciding everyone should get stimmies, the republic was founded to prevent these specifically set out examples, as well as future mob mentality items. Today we're failing on this. A rage for paper money, that the government should send everybody checks. An abolition of debts, that the government should forgive whatever debts that people don't want to pay, whether they're their home mortgages or student loan debts or car loans or credit card debt, whatever it is people don't want to pay. We want to equally divide up all the property. The Founding Fathers knew that these were things that the mob would come to. They're just shown to be perfectly right on point today. They just are. So, but the these things were thought through, right? And here's the finishing of number 10 as they get to the final conclusion of republic versus democracy. And it says, the effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the median of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Now, this is where I think that our current system has gone awry, because I don't believe that politicians are doing what they're doing out of patriotism and love of justice, and are least likely to sacrifice to temporal partial considerations, or these things wouldn't be considered at all. And there's very few people, short of, I would say, in my lifetime, Mr. Ron Paul, Dr. Ron Paul, would be one of the few who has spoken out that the Constitution does not allow for these things. And his son, Rand Paul, is, while different, still one of the few people speaking up about what the Constitution says, what the founding members meant. So they outline it perfectly here. I mean, it continues. So it says, under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more constant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose, i.e. full democracy where the people just vote. And we get 51% of people to go, yeah, the government should print us checks, and everyone goes, yeah, they should print us checks. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. And this is why we do not have a full democracy. This is why our system is set up as a republic, because the founding fathers knew these things. And it's the very end of Federalist Paper number 10, where what I already read, the rage for money, that will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union. So it is the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. So the founding fathers knew the exact things that we're dealing with today were inevitable to happen. Yes, they call them the diseases of a Republican government. This is what inevitably happens, that they've seen throughout history. It happened in the republics in Rome and in Greece, where eventually all of the wickedness takes over, and now all of a sudden you don't have a republic anymore. And that's my concern of where America is headed today. All right, on to Federalist Paper number 12. And obviously I highly recommend going back and reading all these things, but I obviously understand that people don't have that time. Hence, I've synthesized it down for you. And so we have our history of the way that our system was set up financially. But to not understand our history means you're never going to understand what to do in the future to fix it if we can't understand where we've come from. All right, so in Federalist Paper number 12, so it starts with this sentence. I mean, it's the sentence, but the first sentence is, the effects of union upon the commercial prosperity of the states have been sufficiently delineated, i.e., it's better for the states to be together than separate for prosperity of all. The prosperity of commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of natural wealth, and has accordingly become a primary objective of their political cares. And this is them saying, this is how the nation is going to be prosperous, by understanding that commerce must be allowed to prosper and thrive, i.e. the free market. And that is what government should be about, ensuring that that free market continues to exist. Now, it's, let's see, this part of it is, yes. All right, so then we get into taxes, okay? And I probably should have labeled that in this Federalist Paper number 12 things. But now they start talking about how we're going to raise taxes and pay for the government. And they say that, but it is not in this aspect of the subject alone that union will be seen to conduce to the purpose of revenue, i.e., how's the government going to get its money? There are other points of view in which its influence will appear more immediate and decisive. It is evident from the state of the country, from the habits of the people, from the experience we have on the point itself, that it is impractical to raise any very considerable sums by direct taxation. By direct taxation. That's so important, because they follow that up. And he says, tax laws have in vain been multiplied, New methods to enforce the collection have in vain been tried. The public expectation has been uniformly disappointed, and the treasuries of the states have remained emptied. I.e., taxing revenue is non-productive as a means of taxation. This is actually a very interesting premise, which I will discuss in future episodes of once we get into that period of time, that even as the U.S. has increased or decreased taxes, the amount of tax revenue it collects as a percentage of GDP has been pretty consistent over time. And so what the Founding Fathers are alluding to here, although they're saying it very blatantly, if you read the words and understand what these words meant back then, is that taxing people is pointless, impractical to raise any very considerable sums. So let's not do it, And they continue with this, and he says, the popular system of administration inherent in the nature of popular government, coinciding with the real scarcity of money incident to a languid and multilated state of trade, has hitherto defeated every experiment for extensive collection, and has at length taught the different legislatures the folly of attempting them. Holy moly! They lay out right there in the Federalist Papers and in the Constitution. That's the reason they say all the states had to pay taxes at the same rate. Because we're not going to be able to collect from people based on these things, right? Now, I don't think the Founding Fathers foresaw our current tax code, which is immense, right? And having come from that world where you have, we call them code heads because they just keep reading code and code and code and code, meaning that there's so much code to read, it fills rooms. So how could possibly anyone know the rules? And then we go, okay, well, what are most of those things written? Well, most of those are written as ways to not pay taxes. So why do we have so many ways to not pay taxes? Because this is what inevitably ends up in the system when you try and distort it. So the Founding Fathers knew that you couldn't do this. So they said, okay, well, here's how we're going to get revenue, right? They're going to depend on the revenue chiefly on duties, right? So excise taxes, right? And this is what I just went through. The folly of attempting them. So the means of revenue chiefly on duties, right? Personal property is too precarious and invisible a fund to be laid hold of in any other way than by the imperceptible agency of taxes on consumption, i.e., sales tax. When you consume things, we can tax those things that are consumed. But if we just try and tax people's revenue, they're going to hide it. And if we try and tax people on their personal wealth, they're going to hide it. So we're not going to do that. And they talk about why not. They talk about how this hasn't happened before. They talk about how governments keep trying to do it. And then they give us the real why. In France, there is an army of patrols, as they are called, constantly employed to secure their fiscal regulations against the inroads of the dealers in contraband trade. I.e., you've created a black market because people are trying to avoid taxation, so now what do you need to enforce it? You need an army to enforce your taxation. In the United States, we have this army. It's called the Internal Revenue Service. That is an army there to enforce taxation. If we were only doing excise taxes and import and export taxes, if we were only taxing things as the Federalist Papers and as the Constitution say we should, how much shorter would the IRS be? How much smaller? And how much less concerned would any of us citizens be in terms of an IRS audit? Yeah, that's right. You would have zero concern, and they would not tax your wealth at all. They would not tax your revenue. Now, that does not mean they would not tax your consumption. That is a different thing. That is what the Founding Fathers lay out a case for, that is how states should do it, and that states could also tax personal property. However, they say real property, right? And going around this means that you end up with armies and enforcement, right? So we talk about freedom and we talk about standing militaries, and the reality is that the more laws you have on the way you're going to collect revenue, and the more you need an army to enforce these laws, right? And not only the patrols have to go out, because you have the one guy who's the accountant, who understands the taxes that need to be paid. And you got a bunch of people who are defending him because it turns out when you go and ask people for their money, they sometimes get violent. In fact, often do. So now you need a bunch of people to protect them so that they can actually collect that money to bring it back to, well, in France at this time, I'm pretty sure, a king, right? So for the states, they say that, you can tax property, real property, but they say be very careful about it. So that gives us the baseline of what the founding fathers had in their idea for taxes. And it's fascinating in here that they basically go through that it is folly to try and tax people's revenue. But that is exactly what we do in the United States. That's exactly what they told us not to do. And all of the, we'll call them perils, pitfalls, whatever you'd like to call them, all of those problems end up being created when you go against these foundational principles. And so, if you believe in the Constitution because, well, you read it, then you go, well, how did that work until they changed it? And when did they change it? And hence, this is one of the reasons I wanted to put together this series of understanding the financial system in America and where it came from. So if you understand what the Constitution says that real money is gold and silver. That any government dollars need to be backed by that real money. That prevents the government from just printing money whenever they feel like it, i.e. prevents the mob from collecting money whenever they feel like it, and prevents overtaxation of citizens. Now, once the government changed this, there were other issues. But the question first is, how effective was this real money system? Right? Because this is the question I'm going to ask now, right? Because the things we hear about all the time, oh, the Constitution's outdated, it doesn't support now. What about now? Things are digital and, would that matter? And, or the economy's so much bigger than it was then. So how would that matter? But the truth is that if you look at 1776 to 1913, which is when they started really changing the laws, inflation was very low. And in fact, deflation in consumer prices was normal because consumers received the benefit of the free markets and the improvements in technology. And I did an episode on inflation. I'm going to go through a couple of the slides on it here quickly in a minute. But one of the things that is hard to cover in inflation is that we know what the increase in prices are, right? So let's just say, no, I want to buy a book or I want to buy this mouse. All right. Now, that mouse, as the adoption of that mouse increases, the cost to make this actually go down because the person making it gets more efficient at making it. And the supply chain for it becomes more efficient in terms of them creating the materials. And because sales are up, we can reduce the costs and competition will come in to reduce costs. So a lot of the difficulty in explaining inflation and the real amount of money that the government's stealing from its citizens via inflation is the amount of savings that we should all get based off of a free market and improvements in technology. Because as an entrepreneur, this is your job. My job as an entrepreneur is to take something that existed before and make it cheaper, easier, faster. Right? So that I take something and change the way that it's done, and that saves time or money, kind of the same thing. Makes it easier for people, right? Makes their lives better. When you can do these things, then you're reducing the cost to consumers. That's a good thing for consumers. But when we just look at inflation as prices go up, and our assumption, because in the last century that's all that's happened, and we're going to show you why, we also don't get to discuss all of those improvements in technology that have reduced our costs. But I can give you the easiest example that's currently you're probably carrying around with you right now, and that is your cell phone. The technology in your cell phone, between that camera, microphones, the computer itself, would have cost you tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars 30 years ago. They keep putting more technology in that phone every year. But the price is roughly the same, right? But now you can shoot a movie in 3D that you used to need a movie camera for that would have cost you thousands of dollars. You can call people on a phone, which that portable also used to cost you thousands of dollars and cost you dollars per minute in using, right? You're now attached to the internet where you have access to all information across the world at your fingertips instantaneously. The cost of that computer 30 years ago would have filled a room and probably cost $100,000. So all of those costs of all of those components continue to come down as adoption of smartphones proliferates. But our dollars are worth less. So the actual increase in the price of the phone isn't because the cost of everything has really gone up. It's because the amount of dollars in circulation has gone up. So they've robbed us of the free market technological advancements by stealing money from us via inflation. And that's what inflation is. It's theft. And you can see that. And all fiat currencies all have done the same thing. The only difference is the rate at which they inflate. So once there's no correspondence to gold, once there's no requirement, buying power, 1775 to the early 1900s, stays pretty flat, right? All of a sudden the 1900s get here, where we go off the gold standard, and inflation goes bananas. Inflation, i.e., more dollars in circulation, not backed by anything. Fiat currency. So this chart says that when $1 is equivalent to $1.29 over time, the real value of a single US dollar, and I did this between 1775 and 1913, because I wanted to see. So if you started with $1 in 1975, you would need to end with $1.29 and just for inflation in 1913. Okay. Now, so that means inflation in 150 years basically was 30%. But now you look at what that same dollar is. So that $1.29 in 1913. Now you need $31. That's what the government's done to us. That's theft via inflation, which it is a theft. And if you haven't watched my episode on inflation, please go back. So here's the brief synopsis of what is inflation. So it says a general increases in price and fall in the purchasing value of money. Now, the reason inflation is so hard to get our hands around is because it's not just about the money printing and when those dollars happen. It's more money being added to money supply, but then when do prices actually rise? And that is more a factor of psychology. And when people expect prices to rise, then they will continually rise. And once that expectation's in place, it's hard to slow it down. And this is what the U.S. had in the 1970s when the government took us off the gold standard finally, and costs go higher. So again, what about the improvements of productivity that they steal from us? So prices can rise, or should they fall, right? Well, that's all, it depends, but effectively prices should fall because that's all our cumulative, our community return on free markets, on allowing creative destruction to exist, on creating incentives for business owners to create better and new ways to do things where they're incentivized to do it. And they get rich doing it, and we all benefit in the future. The cruelty of inflation is wages never rise as fast as inflation goes up. Businesses can't raise prices as fast. Employees' raises don't match inflation. Benefits costs rise too. And then you have this consumer price index versus actual. So how come prices went up 30% in 150 years, and then over the last 100 years, they've gone up 3,000%, or whatever the number is? It's ridiculous. But that's because it makes government debts cheaper to repay. It's basically government stealing. It's taxation without. And while we just discussed that the founding fathers said we shouldn't be taxing people to begin with, the tax brackets that they currently have don't rise with inflation either. So, your nominal tax rate rises while your purchasing power is already less. This is basically theft of everybody's money. So at the end of the day, everyone earning money has less money left over to purchase goods and services. That's what inflation does across the board to everybody. Now, what does it do for the government? It gives them the ability to print more money, which gives them more power and control, which is what they're after. That's what politicians always want: more power, more control. So, the Founding Fathers said it was a folly to tax. But guess what do you think your government did? All right? Because they got the states to ratify the 16th Amendment, it still stands. Though many of us, myself included, would declare it unconstitutional and would have expected the Supreme Court to throw it out, even though there were some other laws that Congress put in afterwards. But the states basically said, we agree. But that shouldn't have mattered, because the Constitution says this is unconstitutional. So what's the point of having a Constitution if you're just going to throw an amendment on the top of it whenever you feel like it that says the Constitution is not right anymore? Shouldn't we rewrite the Constitution at that point, not have an amendment? And to do that, shouldn't we have a constitutional convention and decide what it's going to be? But that's not politically how things get done. And so, of course, that wasn't going to happen because they weren't going to agree on it. So in my mind, the Supreme Court should have thrown it out. And some people have tried to fight this, right? And they're not wrong in their approach. The Constitution says that the government should not be able to collect income on exactly what they do. So Congress says now we have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So that means that now Congress can tax the citizens whenever and however much it feels like. Not exactly what the Founding Fathers said, because the Founding Fathers specifically said this has been tried and failed. And not only that, is they understand the progress of what this is. So now we're 107 years into this, and we're just seeing how bad a policy all of this really is, and we haven't even got to the really, really bad part that's about to happen next. But so it goes. So, passed by Congress on July 2nd, 1909, ratified February 3rd, 1913. So, what does that really change? That changes taxes on income. That is a huge, huge change, because taxes on income mean the government can now grow, right? The government can now say, we want X amount from all the people, and we can grow. What's the limit? Of course they didn't put themselves in a limit. They didn't say at a maximum of 10% so that they would limit the size of government. No, we want to be able to adjust that based on your income, right? So what immediately is going to happen after that? People with high incomes are going to start moving their finances and moving that money to places with lower taxation. And this game has now been played for over 100 years, right? Now, some guys, like Peter Schiff's dad, actually took this to the Supreme Court. Now, of course, the Supreme Court is basically useless at this point. It's supposed to be the actual part of the Constitution that says we've got this separate power over here, where the Supreme Court's supposed to tell people when it's unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court went, we're not going to do anything. Oh, wait, those are all political appointees, aren't they? Yeah. Okay. Not surprising why they didn't do anything then, is it? All right, the next folly that they create. And this folly is just as good as the one in student loans. So if you didn't listen to my one on student loans on how that whole mess got created, go listen to that separately. But basically, a few people in government got all the rest of government to agree that, oh, well, there's a few doctors who are getting these high numbers of student loans, and we're worried that they're going to default and not pay people back. And we need doctors, so we need to guarantee those student loans and make sure that people can't get rid of those in bankruptcy. Hence, your student loan crisis that's now been created, where governments are the ones backing the loans and preventing them from getting forgiven regardless of circumstance. Thank you very much for that problem, federal government. Here's where they did it on the entire banking system. Oh, a few banks had runs on them over the last 30 years, and so we're worried that banks will continue to have runs. And why do a bank have a run on it? Because people no longer have confidence in it and they want to get their money out. So it used to be that you, the citizen, had to do your own due diligence about the bank that had your money. and you had to be getting a return from them, or you wouldn't be giving them your money to begin with, and you had to believe that you would get it back. And if you did not believe you would get it back, you would go down there and you would take your money out and take it to another bank that you did believe in, or put it under the mattress, as they used to say, right? So instead, what do we do now? We're going to create a Federal Reserve System that is the central bank will provide with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. Founding fathers were right on this one. Folly as well. All of this thing, does it feel today like we're in a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system than ever? Tesla just bought Bitcoin, which will also tell people when I made this, so you go look that up as well. That does not sound like safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. That sounds like bubbles and chaos and mass speculation created by said Federal Reserve. We'll get into that later. Let's continue with what actually happened. So, the Federal Reserve Act, go ahead and get yourself one of these guys if you want to read more about it, sets out the power of the Federal Reserve. And what's the power of the Federal Reserve? Oh, that basically the Federal Reserve isn't owned by us, the people. Now, it's the central bank of the United States, but it's not actually part of the federal government. And we, the citizens, have no control over it, and we can't audit it, and it's not accountable to us. So who does own it? All of the member banks. So, welcome to Bank Lobbying 101, and how banks became such an important part of the entire financial system. Federal Reserve Act. All right. So, the Federal Reserve was set up to be independent of the U.S. government. Now, again, independent but run by all the banks who, especially at this point, do all the political campaign contributions to who gets elected. So independence at this point is pretty iffy at best. However, that relationship held for a little while. And then post-World War I, Federal Reserve becomes a tool of the government and basically has not been independent since. So what did the Federal Reserve do back then? World War I, they started selling government war bonds for the government. And of course, the banks got a piece of the action, as always. And they told customers, and there was huge campaigns to tell everyone, buy the government war bonds. Yeah, they don't pay as much and inflation's running higher. You're actually losing money, but you're giving it to your government who needs it for the war. So it sounded like a good cause. A bunch of people bought. Banks made a lot of money, grew and just grew and grew and grew. And that's all banks have done since then. It's got bigger and bigger and bigger, such that the last 15 years ago, it was they're systemically too big to fail. And what do? We made them bigger and bigger. So once again, we go back to, oh, wait a minute. The Federal Reserve was supposed to, hold on. Let me go back to that so we can look at it again, because this is what it says. This is from the Federal Reserve's website. A safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. I gotta believe that has not happened. Doesn't seem it. Now, what's interesting is that the U.S. still kept the gold standard. So in order to be accepted as a global currency, the U.S. had to keep the gold standard as requirement for Bretton Woods. Now, that didn't happen until 1934, but it still happened. The gold standard would not last, but the Bretton Woods Agreement would not either, but for a short time it did. So here's one of those ideas for exploration that's very, very interesting. So the U.S. is on the gold standard as required by Bretton Woods in 1934. But transacting gold in the United States at that same time also becomes illegal. That's a very interesting thing the government did to us, and I believe completely unconstitutional, and one of those things where, again, the Supreme Court should have stepped in and said, the Constitution says that gold and silver are money. How can we have a government telling us that not only are gold and silver not money anymore, even though they're backing all of the money, strangely enough, but that we can't transact in them anymore? So we have to transact now in U.S. dollars, in U.S. currency, fiat currency. Not, well, at that time, still backed by gold, the gold that you weren't allowed to own. So 1933 is the end of real money. Roosevelt calls it a banking holiday, but, this is what government does. They call it a holiday, but what it is a period of time where you can't get your money out of any bank. And they call this holiday to help try and stop the run on banks such that they can preserve the current system that it's in, because people were panicked and wanted to get their money out, i.e., way worse than toilet paper, because you're talking about people's wealth in 1933. People don't view it that way anymore. I got a sneaking suspicion long-term this may come back again, and we may see this again in our lifetimes. So Roosevelt shuts down the banks to address the redemptions of everyone trying to get their money out. Then they fix the rates. So government fixes bond rates to less than inflation. Effectively, they're stealing citizens' money. Government fixes prices, forcing businesses to lose money when they have to pay more for goods they're allowed to sell them. All sorts of, of government intervention starts to happen. And they do it all with mostly executive orders from Roosevelt, who signed the most executive orders of anyone ever. The Supreme Court did not strike down one of them. So 1,300 executive orders from Roosevelt, not one of them was declared unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. This is why I say the Supreme Court has not done its job. The Constitution lays out what these things are how these things are supposed to work, what's supposed to happen, who's supposed to control who. Federal Reserve does whatever it wants. President doing whatever he wants. Congress doing whatever they want. The one person or one group that's supposed to keep them in check is the Supreme Court. But they're not doing their job. So this puts the banks in charge. The Federal Reserve is now a privately owned institution that controls all the money in the country. So the banks get to decide when to print more money. What could possibly go wrong? And gold becomes, like I said, illegal. So Roosevelt makes gold illegal in an attempt to increase U.S. gold reserves and prevent money from leaving the country. Now, they didn't just take it from everybody. They did give everybody $21.65 per ounce for their gold, but that was far less than the fair market value of the gold itself. So the government officially ends the use of what the Constitution says is money. Redemption is far less than fair value, but government keeps the gold as backing for the U.S. currency, and the Supreme Court just gets down on its knees and says, we agree. It doesn't do anything about it. All right, so that's a short-lived period where the U.S. goes into massive amounts of debt and fighting World War II. Post-World War II, the U.S. wins. And although I would say, based on my read of history, that especially when it comes to war in Europe, that the Russians were the ones that won the war. Had the Germans not gone to Russia, I fully believe that Hitler would and the German Reich would be in charge of all of Europe to this day, and Britain too. But the decision to go to Russia was a terrible one for them. They got hung up in Stalingrad during the winter. The Russians were able to mobilize their forces and were kicking the crap out of them all the way back to Germany when the U.S. forces landed in Normandy. Had the U.S. forces never landed, the Russians still would have got to Munich and to Berlin probably just a couple of months later. And had the German forces not been divided on both sides, fighting both the Russians and the U.S.-led allies, I don't believe that invasion, A, would have ever happened, or B, would have gone as it did. There would have been so much more resistance, so much more heavy fighting. I don't believe the U.S. would have been able, using Britain as the launching point, to have been able to take over the German forces. And in fact, I believe the German forces would have bombed England much harder and would have eventually taken those islands. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but so it goes. However, the U.S. wins the war. We're told we're the winners. And as part of that, the U.S. dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. And at the Bretton Woods summit in Bretton Woods, Connecticut, there was an agreement made. And the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold and exchangeable for gold at any time. Just like are original certificates, redeemable in gold. The gold standard was why everyone else agreed, because then the U.S. wasn't just in charge of printing money. Gold was backing all of that money, and those countries could get gold from the U.S. whenever needed. But this set the stage for how the International Monetary Fund works and how pretty much international money works to this day, even though the gold standard is now gone. So 44 countries agreed to peg their currency to the value of the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar is pegged to gold. So therefore, all of those currencies are effectively pegged to gold. This was the agreement. Goods across the world were all priced in U.S. dollars. This did create a high need for U.S. dollars for international trade because everyone was trading amongst U.S. dollars, despite the goods never coming through the United States. So, when does this end? 1971, the gold standard ends. Effectively, and if you remember back from the prior graph of inflation, and that graph can basically be linked just to dollars in circulation, the U.S. puts too much dollars into circulation. This was from fighting the Korea Wars and specifically the Vietnam War, where we're just printing the money to fight it. Well, foreign countries get wise to this and they go, okay, well, we want to give you back our dollars and get the gold. And this was happening from countries, not from people, from countries. And in 1971, Nixon says we are not going to give up all of our gold because it's about to literally be shipped on planes and boats to other countries. So instead, takes us off the gold standard, says U.S. currency is no longer redeemable in gold, and says that this is, when he comes out and says this, he says this is temporary. Instead of it being temporary, it becomes very much permanent. Now, the only sideline of this is that in 1975, gold becomes legal to own again in the United States. Previously, for that period, for 42 years, it was illegal to own gold in the U.S. So basically, the puzzle falls apart. So now, 1971, nothing's pegged to gold. All currencies in the world basically become fiat, and governments just start printing money like crazy. All of them do it. It's not like one thing happens. But the dollar standard still remains the dollar standard, meaning that most transactions in the world, I think right now it's about 80% of all international trade flows are still conducted in U.S. dollars. Now that amount is reducing and will continue to reduce because why is the U.S. dollar worth more than a European euro? The euro dollar system? I don't know. I can't understand it either. It's just literally the amount in circulation versus the need. And U.S. dollars are still in high need because people were on the dollar system for so long. So the dollar remains as the U.S. global reserve currency for now. And a lot of countries still peg or use the U.S. dollar, like literally use it. There's a bunch of countries where the U.S. dollar is the currency that is used. They don't even use the local currency anymore. Now, other side effects of this, currency wars begin. Countries manipulate their currency to help their exports, China being the most famous of this, but they're not the only ones. And you've got other problems. Countries who can't print their own money anymore, like Greece and Italy, end up in economic crises because they can't devalue their currency like they used to. And that's why you saw Greece and Italy bonds in the huge Greece crisis. They used to just print their own money. It became inflated, but they had control over it. Now they gave up that control. It's a problem. Many companies have the same problem with that still are on the dollar standard. Now, the dollar standard is good for U.S. purchasing of goods, but it's really bad for U.S. manufacturers. And U.S. dollars printing goes into high gear over the last 20 years. Now, this exacerbates the wealth gap. It punishes savers. It creates additional taxes without representation on the citizens because that's what inflation does. And again, go listen to the specific inflation podcasts if you haven't heard those. So here's the currency in circulation since 1970. And you can just see the explosion of currency since we've come off the gold standard. And this is not like me making up some chart. This is from the St. Louis Fed. This is from the Federal Reserve itself. This is their data. I'm just going in and pulling it out. And so we could track this 200 line here. That's 1985. Since 1985, there's 10 times more money out there than there was in 1985. The government printed 10x what was out there. Whoa. So $2,000 today is effectively $200 in 1980. That's what the chart says to me. Now, prices may not completely reflect that. And these gray columns in between, if you're wondering what those are recessions. The Fed does like to point those out. But basically, money printing 101. Here we go. Print the money. This is exactly what the founding fathers were afraid of. They literally called it. They said that it would, that this is what would happen. Everyone would want money. And that's what they're doing. So let's talk about how the 1913 impacts today and today's monetary system. So first we have the Federal Reserve Act, right? Created the central bank and begins the system of not allowing banks to fail. It begins the transition to power of banking and the banking system. If you look at the markets in 1913, banks were a small fraction of markets. Now they dominate markets. Bank earnings dominate markets. That did not used to be the case. So the transition of power to the banks is massive. It also sets the stage, 1913 does, for the transition off of the gold standard. While that may not have been the original intent, if we did not have a central bank and did not have the central banking system in place, it's possible that the 1929 crash and the mass speculation that was underway there may not have happened. It's also very possible that that the gold standard never goes away because the 29 crash doesn't happen. So the causes of the 29 crash, the Federal Reserve can't be left out of the causes. It's part of the problem, and it's part of the problem right now as well. So the 16th Amendment, the power to tax revenue, gives government control over its own size. To grow the size of government, they just tax more and tax more and tax more. Now, the interesting thing about this that I discussed earlier, and I'll go into more detail in the next episode, is that the amount of tax receipts from the government basically stays flat despite what the tax rates are. So the government thinks it can just keep taxing everybody. But there's this old saying, good money drives out bad money. And what they're saying behind that is that the good money will just leave the country. And that's exactly what's happened. Whether it's companies moving their international headquarters out of the U.S., or if it's citizens moving their money out of the U.S., people are not going to deal with super high tax rates. They'll just avoid them, and they always do. And of course, then there's the tons of loopholes built into the tax code that you need a lawyer and an accountant to get through so you can figure out how to not pay taxes. So the wealthy don't pay taxes. Everybody else pays way more than they should. The government's out of control in its size. And basically, this allows the government to just start its expansion that never ends. And we're there. So now not only do politicians tax handouts, Washington grows with its ability to tax, but now all of a sudden special interests gain power. Now all of a sudden the amount of funds the government has to distribute continues to grow, which means the power continues to increase, which means the political influence continues to increase on that. And that creates all of these problems, which the founding fathers laid out in great detail of exactly what would happen if we allowed this to. And that's exactly what's going on now. So the end of the gold standard. Now, it's crazy to me to think that we went from a country where the Constitution says gold and silver are money to a country where it's illegal to have gold. And for 40 years, that's what we lived under. Now, the government hasn't gotten rid of the gold. It still has the gold. So if the gold's not money, then why does the government have it? And why are central banks around the world buying gold if gold isn't money? So we have fiat currencies, and then we have money. And in my opinion right now, gold and silver our money, and the rest of it's fiat currency, not backed by anything. So we now end up in this mass taxation to sustain these debts, because that's the other thing that we haven't discussed, is how the Federal Reserve and their low interest rates are allowing mass debts to occur. And those debts will then have to be repaid. Obviously, they want to use inflation and keep playing this game, but at some point, all of these wheels and all of these things that are interconnected, and all we got to do is take one arrow and flip it. So the real problem that we deal with today is none of the control from any of these things has been relinquished by governments at all. It sets the table for all the government problems that we deal with today. Special interest groups, tax credits, lobbying power, lifetime politicians. The founding fathers warned specifically against all of these things, but we didn't listen. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court didn't do its job. It didn't prevent government from overreach. It didn't prevent the president from stepping on the Constitution. It didn't prevent Congress from stepping on the Constitution. And now, more than ever, it seems as though everyone's agreeing that this is okay and that this is going to end well, when I promise you it will not. That's episode 2 in this series. We'll be back with episode 3 of how this impacts us more today, and eventually we'll end up down the road at how we could possibly fix this thing. So thanks for listening. Please pass this along to your friends and family, anyone who's trying to educate themselves about how the American system got this way. I realize that I go through a lot of these things quite quickly. I just covered all of U.S. history of the financial system up to recent times in an hour, which is crazy in terms of what you could read. But I do highly recommend, and I please beg of everyone, read the Constitution, right? If you're more interested, read the Federalist Papers. They are the framers of the Constitution laying out the arguments for us in plain sight to say, this is why we set it up the way that we did. Here's the pitfalls that we see if you go down other routes. I hope this is educational and informative. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.